Hello and welcome to the Intentional Brief, your weekly video update on the one big thing in cybersecurity news for growth stage companies, their investors, and their management teams. I'm your host, Shay Colson, managing partner at Intentional Cybersecurity, and you can find us online at intentionalcyber.com. Today is Monday, August 12th, 2024, and while there was some late breaking news over the weekend about a breach of Donald Trump's campaign, allegedly, although still unconfirmed, by Iran, I'm going to let that one sit for a week and focus on some of the important bits coming out of last week's BlackHat conference in Las Vegas. If the Trump stuff becomes worth talking about it, we will address it here. Meanwhile, last week saw the annual security conference known as BlackHat and its sister event DEF CON take place in Las Vegas, also known as Hackers Summer Camp. This conference typically features a high level of who's who in the space, including lots of good talks, some vendors, but also some good research, news, and keynotes. As somebody who couldn't justify the time and effort to attend this year and make the trek, I did pay very close attention to the news and notes coming out of the event, and I wanted to trickle a couple of those themes into this week's brief, mostly coming out of the keynote by CISA Director Jen Easterly, in which I think she really threw down the gauntlet to tech companies saying, quote, "We don't have a cybersecurity problem, we have a software quality problem," unquote. CISA is, of course, leading the charge on the government side in a secure by design effort. And she said from the stage that it's past time that software vendors no longer consider vulnerabilities as, quote, "an inevitable act of nature," unquote, when other industries would consider similar flaws as alarming product defects. This obviously, I think, will continue to drive discussions around software liability, which today are typically waved away by pretty robust click-through terms of use that we're all familiar with, and none of us actually read. Easterly did call for congressional action on this effort to address the liability component, which seems frankly unlikely for a host of reasons at this point. She was not the only one with this message, however. On another talk, Natalie Silvanovich, the team lead and security engineer for Google's Project Zero, their zero-day threat research initiative, noted that, quote, "It's becoming increasingly apparent that security research is not enough to end the era of 0 days," unquote. She noted that, quote, "We're not in a place to make the next big changes that need to happen to protect users from 0 days. Vendors are. This is not an easy task, and many vendors have made a lot of progress since we started, but there is so much left to do," unquote. Natalie had some really interesting numbers and other data points in her talk, including one that caught my eye where she noted that, quote, "Up to 40% of in-the-wild zero-day flaws are variants of existing flaws, meaning that they are similar to flaws already fixed in software. This could indicate that vendors are rushing into fixes for their 0 days as a result of pressure and time constraints, and as a result are producing incomplete fixes that aren't addressing the root cause issue behind the flaw," unquote. What she's saying here sounds similar to Easterly's notes on software quality or lack thereof, and even when an issue is discovered, the response is to just quickly slap something together and get it out the door instead of understanding the root cause. Now, I don't think that companies don't understand the root cause. I think that fixing the root cause is time consuming and expensive because early decisions were made that drove the product down this path. Architectural changes, systemic changes, the sorts of underpinnings that would be needed to address some of these root causes are simply too big, cumbersome, expensive, or time-consuming to do. And so we see these slapdash fixes that, actually don't create any additional benefit and may increase the risk. The other area that Natalie focused on in her talk, which I thought was really interesting, is what she called, quote, "a security gap between the best we see and the worst we see," and that is large and growing. What she means here is that the worst offending companies appear to be in this middleware or firmware and software area where that is then sold upstream to larger vendors, and that this is an increasing area of focus for attackers. I think it's obvious that attackers will focus on these things because the impact is so outsized. If you can get a vulnerability, an exploit, or some sort of a foothold on a piece that is then used by tens, hundreds, thousands of other companies, that's going to give you a lot more ROI for your effort from the attacker's perspective. So obviously that's going to be an area where they focus their attention. This kind of mechanic, I think, also highlights the complexity of the digital ecosystem that we live in, and it's one that doesn't seem poised to improve or reduce risk anytime soon. I think ultimately, as users and consumers of these pieces of flawed software and technology, we really aren't left with many options other than lobbying Congress like Easterly suggests. We aren't going to write better software, and our choices in the market aren't exactly clear in terms of who is a safe bet and who is not. See CrowdStrike for the latest example. And even if we could see the flaws, we aren't in a position to resolve them because of the nature of closed source software and the nature of writing and deploying this technology. I think ultimately this leaves us in a particularly undesirable position of having to manage risk down to acceptable levels and then build in alternatives and redundancies where we can. It really does seem like there is a change coming in this space led by the top and then supported by the market. The problem is that this change is not coming fast enough for any of us to enjoy it. So in the meantime, we're left with the least worst choice set, and that's not an enviable position to be in. From a fundraising perspective, another relatively light week with nearly the exact same amount, $7.8 billion of newly committed capital, as we saw the week prior, spread across just a handful of fund announcements. As I previously noted, I would just see this as the summer slump, and things should be, I would say, relatively quiet for the next couple of weeks as we close out the summer. Meanwhile, some new research this week from consulting firm EY that is headlined, quote, PE sees its strongest quarter in 2 years, which had lots of interesting numbers and analysis. Of note, the following bits. One, they said that out of 250 separate PE funds that have closed this year, the top 20 funds have accounted for 61% of the total raised. Interesting. They note that M&A valuations have dropped a little bit from their high of 11x, settling in at around 9.5x. And they also noted that 2/3 of the reduction here is driven by prices dropping from the seller side to make the deal happen. They also had a passing note on exits being challenging, with their survey indicating the biggest reason why exits aren't happening being, quote, GPs are waiting for portfolio company financial position or market position to improve, unquote. Well, that would certainly explain why these exits aren't happening, and I think comes back around to some of these fundamental financial mechanics as you see some of the take privates going in the marketplace now, and a lot of these large late stage players struggling to exit. The numbers just aren't there. The businesses that they've built don't seem to be sustainable or particularly profitable in their current structure. So we're going to have to see some changes like the software piece that we talked about. I'm not sure these changes are going to happen fast enough for us to enjoy them, but therein lies the challenge. You can find links to all of the articles we covered below in the comments section. You can find back issues of these videos and written transcripts at intentionalcyber.com. And we will see you next week for another edition of the Intentional Brief.